every now and again a movie surprises me. I don't really have any expectations, or I have low expectations, and I go in and I walk out saying, wow, that was actually really good. I didn't really expect it to be at all. It's always kind of a very pleasant surprise to have. Because, I mean, there's something to be said for it. I mean, like, if you go in and see a movie like The Dark Knight, I knew it was going to be a good movie. The trailers made it look good. Heath Ledger and Kristen Bale were in it. Christopher Nolan was directing. There was no way that was going to be a bad movie. But for something like this, a friend of mine was like, why don't we watch this film? I've heard good things about it. Like, I've never heard of it. It looks kind of like an indie film with a minuscule budget. Looking at it now, it only had a budget of $1.5 million. I don't know, it could be some kind of crummy indie film, but yeah, I'll give it a try. Unsane is kind of an interesting title. And I started watching it, and I immediately noticed the footage is really kind of weird. So to kind of add kind of a gritty, realistic thing to it, this movie was entirely shot in an iPhone 7 Plus, which is an interesting idea. It kind of works because they're kind of going for a bit of a found footage B-movie feel to this, and the camera angles are really weird. I guess it's to kind of add to the realism. I don't really know how I feel about it, to be honest. It didn't detract from the movie. I don't know if it would have been as effective if it had kind of a more traditional setup. But yeah, I really like this movie. So, I hadn't realized it when I was watching it, but this film stars Claire Foy. And I thought she was very familiar, and I couldn't place her because her hair's a different color, and I'm bad with faces. But she plays Queen Elizabeth on the first 2 seasons of The Crown, and I thought she did a really good job there, and she does a really good job in this movie. So, Unsane is interesting, because it kind of plays with your expectations a bit. Like, it started off as... It's not really a horror movie. It has horror aspects, but it's more of a psychological thriller. And you don't really know where it's going. Is the main character crazy? Is she not crazy? Is there supernatural aspects going on? Is there no supernatural aspects? Etc. And it kind of keeps you guessing till about midway. And once it kind of settles on and decides on what it's going with, it's a really fascinating movie that I think has a lot of interesting ideas. So we're going to get into spoilers now. I'm going to start talking about the plot and break it down. So the main character, Sawyer Valentini, I'll just call her Sawyer, keeps moving from from location to location to escape a stalker who is named Strine, David Strine. So we'll just call him Strine for the rest of this review. So she keeps moving from place to place to try to escape Strine. She starts at a new job at a bank, which she's apparently really good at. Her boss is a sleazy asshole who tries to hit on her. And she feels kind of uncomfortable about this. And it's not just like he asked her out. He's like, hey, baby, why don't you come to this conference with me? We can share a room together. That kind of like sleazy thing. So she goes to see a counselor because she's having trouble dealing with men because of this creepy guy who is chasing her around and kind of the issue she's having with her boss. So she goes to see a counselor at a hospital, and the counselor, they seem to get along well together. She says that occasionally she feels like killing herself to get it over with, but that being able to talk to someone really helped. And the counselor just gives her some paperwork to fill out for further sessions. But it turns out that the paperwork she signed were actually committal forms. And they immediately like grab her. They make her strip. They start drugging her up and they put her into the institution. And you're like, what the hell's going on? And you don't really know where it's going at all. But the doctor tells her that she signed a form committing to a voluntary... signed a form committing her to a 24 hours of treatment. And basically she's like freaking out. And that's kind of one of the things in this movie. She's kind of dumb, like in most horror movies, but given the stress of the situation, I think it portrays it a little more realistically. So they kind of throw her into a room with a bunch of crazy people, and she tries to get out, and she attacks a staff member trying to get out. And then there's this crazy psycho bitch who keeps attacking her, and whenever she fights back, and they use this as a justification to extend her stay to a week. So she finds out another patient, Nate Hoffman, who's played by some rapper, explains things to her, and he explains to her, and this is kind of interesting because I thought we aren't sure if she's crazy and how much of this is in her head, and he tells her that this whole thing is a scam. They trick people into signing voluntary commitment forms so they can bill their health companies for the cost of their treatment program. So they'll they'll trick people into signing on for detox programs or some other sort of thing and keep them there as long as they can until their insurance runs out. And this is really scary because I could see this happening. Like, this sort of thing happens with private prisons. And we know that the healthcare industry in America is involved with all kinds of shady stuff. So is it possible that they would trick people into signing voluntary commitment forms so they could bill health companies? That sounds extremely possible to me. And it's a good example of not needing supernatural elements to be scary, because it's a terrifying idea that they do that. And they keep her drugged and sedated and stuff to kind of keep her in line. Now, people might be confused by this because I'm generally fairly pro-medication. I think what you have to understand is psychiatric medication has to be for a specific purpose. Like, if you have suicidal depression, it's an antidepressant. If you have severe type 1 bipolar, it's lithium. If you're psychotic, you need an antipsychotic. And its goal should be to try to make you as functional as possible, not just drug you into a comatose state. The only people who really need to be drugged into a comatose state are people with severe psychosis, who are just constantly violent if they aren't kind of drugged. But that's clearly not the case. In this movie, they just keep drugging her. So it turns out that Nate is actually an undercover reporter who's going to expose all this stuff. He's taking notes, he's been recording things, he's been talking to his news network, and he's going to blow this whole thing open. They're going to expose how corrupt the medical industry is. So he manages to... So as this is going on, she sees that her stalker, David Strine, has assumed the name of George Shaw, one of the nurses, and is the guy who gives out the medication. Now, once again, we don't know if she's crazy or not. Is she just assuming that this is him because she has PTSD and she's kind of imagining things? Is she actually crazy? Is this actually the guy? And it's ambiguous for a little while. So she freaks out and she gets punished again. And she gets Nate to lend her her cell phone, and this time she calls her mother. And she talks to her mother, and she explains the situation to her. And her mother's like, look, I've been waiting for years for you to tell me what's wrong. I'm going to come help you. I'm going to bring an army of lawyers and the police, etc., and we're going to come and save you. And earlier in the movie, she had tried to call the police, but the police are either corrupt or incompetent or whatever, and they won't do anything to help her out. Probably because they're getting paid off by the health insurance company. So her mother comes, and her mother sees her, and she's like, you're not crazy. I believe you about this psycho stalker guy. I'm going to get you out of here. So she goes to a new bar. She goes to a motel, and basically is like, I'm going to stay here till you get out. At this point, Sawyer's only going to be in the place for about another 7 days or whatever, so she can just wait it out. And if they want to keep her in there longer, they have to get a court order, and that would cost too much money. So Strine begins to screw with her, and he gives her a massive dose of methamphetamine, which just kind of makes her go crazy. Let's see here. That evening, Strine goes to her mother's hotel and presumably kills her, which we'll find out later in the movie. So Sawyer talks to Nate and says that David was the son of a patient who had Alzheimer's disease when she worked at a hospice. And after his father died, David became obsessed with Sawyer, seeing her as his ideal, his waifu, basically. He became a yandere, or however you pronounce it, towards her, seeking to kill everybody in his path. So David sees Sawyer and Nate talking to one another and feels threatened. He knocks Nate unconscious and puts him into the basement. He uses an ECT device to torture him, and then gives him a mega dose of fentanyl. He had pretended to be in the... His excuse for coming in to like spy on the program was that he was getting over a opioid addiction. So the staff, being corrupt as they are, dismiss him somehow breaking out, getting into the basement, and getting a mega dose of it. And having all the other just bruise marks for where David beat him up as simply... So David, after killing Nate, plants Nate's cell phone on her bed with pictures of Nate being brutally beaten, and then the staff put her into solitary confinement because she had a cell phone, which is against the rules. So David visits Sawyer again and tells her that he doctored the records to make it look like her insurance ran out and that she had checked out a couple days ago, and that nobody knows that she's in solitary confinement. He tells her that he has a secluded mountain cabin that he wants to take her to. So Sawyer's getting a little smarter, so she mocks him for being a virgin and having an experience with women. And elsewhere they find the body of the nurse that David killed. Or I guess Strine is what I said that I'd call him. So Sawyer feigns concern that David is a virgin and that she's worried that he only wants her because he's horny. So if he has sex with another woman first, that'll prove that he loves her. And David's a psycho, so he's like, this makes sense to me. So she says that... So David believes her. So she says, why don't you go get Violet, that psycho bitch from earlier? So David gets Violet and brings her back down into the isolation cell. So Sawyer has... So he brings Violet down. And Violet, of course, has a knife in her waistband. So Sawyer grabs the knife and stabs David in the neck with it, however not killing him, and locks him in the room and runs out. David immediately snaps the neck of Violet, killing her, and manages to survive. So Sawyer barely gets out when David knocks her out and puts her in the trunk of his car next to her mother. Meanwhile, the police show up at the institution and they find Violet's body, and they start looking through things, and they find Nate's notebook, which they had confiscated and presumably were going to burn, that had all his notes on what was going on. So the police just start tearing the place apart and arrest everybody. Meanwhile, like I said, Sawyer's in the trunk of the car, and she manages to break out of the... So she grabs her mother's crucifix and runs into the woods. David catches up with her and uses a hammer to break one of her ankles. However, she stabs him in the eye with the crucifix and then jumps on him and slits his throat with it, finally killing her stalker. We cut forward 6 months where Sawyer has just received a large promotion, and she thinks she sees David sitting in the restaurant, and she approaches him armed with a knife, but realizes it's not him and runs away. Which raises the question, how much of this was in her mind, how much of it wasn't? What's going on? What are going to be kind of the long-term impacts of this whole movie, the events of the film on her? So I have to say I really liked the movie. It was really intense. I didn't know where it was going for the majority of it. The whole fake like healthcare committee against the will scam is scary. Movies in which people think you're crazy so they don't take you seriously are really scary. It's just kind of a worst case scenario, especially when they're drugging you and putting you in isolation and stuff. The uncertainty as to whether or not her stalker is... And I really wasn't sure where the movie was going until the end. I mean, in a good way. I didn't know like what twists and turns they were going to take. Were they going to introduce supernatural elements? Was Strine real, or was he just in her head? etc. Was she just seeing him where he wasn't? Had he ever even existed, or was the whole thing just once again kind of a delusion of her? So I gotta say, I absolutely love the movie. I'd highly recommend to go see it. That's about all I have to say. More reviews to come, and I'll talk to you guys later.